Bosses have historically been an essential part of the overall experience in video games. They do vary in importance and significance, but rarely are they ever not at least a part of the full experience. Enemies that are typically more powerful than regular enemies and can absorb abnormal amounts of damage from the player are what generally constitutes a boss. But the reason why these challenging enemies with accelerated abilities are called bosses appears to be up for debate. It is interesting to note that in early 1980s Japan, the head of Yakuza mafia families were sometimes referred to as a basu. Translating basu directly to English would give you the word boss, so perhaps that's part of the equation. Nevertheless, the term boss stuck very early on in video game terminology and opened the door to many other commonly used phrases like boss rush, mini boss, and final boss that are still used to this day. Some games have such great boss fights that they can define the whole game of which they are a part, but some just seem to exist to be what is commonly referred to as bullet sponges. These boss battles are more about quantity than quality and seem to be more and more prevalent in games, as some games, particularly online shooters, are focusing on repetitive levels and tasks to acquire randomized loot with your friends instead of driving a character through a story and encountering many unique enemies and other characters along the way. This does elicit some degree of complaints from a lot of gamers, understandably so, even though in my opinion not every boss battle needs to be as outstanding as the battle with Poseidon in God of War 3. Technically, you could say every boss is a bullet sponge at some level, given that the ability to absorb more damage than normal enemies is one of the things that makes a boss a boss. What kind of a boss battle would it be if the object of your character's scorn had the exact same health as a typical enemy? But what seems to separate quality memorable boss battles like the helicopter from Metal Gear Solid from the lesser boss battles like the helicopter that just floats around and absorbs rounds from you and your friends in Tom Clancy's The Division is the interactions between you and the boss. Does the boss have a variety of attacks that change as the boss acquires more damage? Is there a character-driven motivation for the boss fight like there was between James and Eddie in Silent Hill 2? Or is it just a different guy that your character comes across that happens to have a rocket launcher and 600% health? Does the boss require a particular strategy to defeat, or could you potentially get through the fight with any weapon or strategy? If the fight isn't dynamic and subject to change, or have any kind of context within the story to motivate you to defeat them, then to me, the boss is going to run the risk of feeling like a boring bullet sponge. As I said, not every boss battle needs to be a groundbreaking, adrenaline-filled campaign of hostility and bloodshed, and thusly, in my opinion, not every bullet sponge is necessarily a bad thing. This may seem like me being an overly aggressive devil's advocate here, but at the end of the day, it really just boils down to what kind of game you want to play. For example, if you're playing a game where the primary focus is social interaction with your friends, with the game more or less just serving as a backdrop for you to hang out and talk, like a lot of modern shooters these days, maybe it's not a bad idea to have less complex boss fights that don't require a whole lot of brain power and concentration. As much as I personally prefer gaming experiences like God of War, Silent Hill, and Metal Gear Solid, I wouldn't generally use them as an environment in which to catch up with my friends. Games like Destiny are better suited for this, as I can put 80% of my focus on talking to my buddies and socializing, and the remaining 20% on getting through the game cooperatively with them. If I tried to get through some of the more difficult sections of Metal Gear Solid while talking to my friends about work and ex-girlfriends, I would probably do terribly, and I would end up being distracted and neither handling the conversation or the game itself very well. It's just better to have a more simple and repetitive experience to go along with social time. To say that developers actually have that particular scenario in mind and aren't just using the bullet sponge style bosses out of laziness might be hard to know for sure, but it's probably safe to say they do like and benefit from the shorter and therefore cheaper development cycles that bullet sponge bosses allow. And ultimately, that is a trend that we as gamers who enjoy quality experiences may want to keep in check. Anecdotal benefits of simple experiences aside, it is in fact true that bullet sponges are more prevalent than they have been in the past. Boss battles have traditionally been the sections of games that developers and gamers alike have enjoyed, sometimes more than any other aspect of games, but now they seem to be slipping into an optional category for a lot of franchises. A perfect encapsulation of the quality drop in boss battles in video games is, as much as it pains me to say it, the Metal Gear Solid franchise. The bosses in Metal Gear Solid 1, 2, and 3 are nothing short of incredible. The bosses' characters are as unique as they are diverse, and they summon intense emotions and motivations from the player. Usually they change up their attacks as the fight progresses, keeping the battle miles away from ever feeling even remotely stale. Who doesn't remember struggling to figure out how to beat Psycho Mantis until they ultimately plugged their controller into controller port 2? Kojima saw opportunities to make the boss battles just as memorable as any other section of the games, if not more so. Metal Gear 4's bosses were still great, but not quite on the level of the previous 3 games perhaps, and Metal Gear Solid 5's bosses are pretty much what I'm talking about here. While still not what I would call bad, these battles didn't feature a lot of motivation, character, or unique strategy, at least in comparison to the previous games. This is a sad decline that, unfortunately for us, is really just a microcosm of what's happening in boss battles in lots of games across all platforms. Just like with most trends in gaming that we may not largely be in favor of, as long as people keep buying them, they won't go away. That being said, quality boss fights likely do await us in upcoming games like the new God of War and Marvel's Spider-Man. So even though bullet sponges are certainly a thing now, memorable quality bosses aren't going away either, and that's a good thing.
And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from Gaming Bolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.